The desert always woke before the soldiers did. Out in the open expanse of Fort Apache, a training ground tucked into the sandy flats of southern Arizona, the first signs of life weren't the hum of engines or the shuffle of boots, but the restless stirrings of the wind. It carried with it the grit of the desert floor, brushing against hangars and helipads, rattling metal sheets, and sneaking into every crack of every barracks door. By the time the sun edged over the mountains, its light hit rows of camouflaged Apaches, lined like sentinels, their long rotor blades stretching toward the horizon. For Private First Class Elena Ramirez, mornings were always about rhythm. She moved with the clock, not because she wanted to, but because the Army demanded it. Wake at 0430. Roll the thin blanket into a perfect square. Boots laced, face washed, hair tied neatly under the brown regulation cap. She never complained, never sighed at the monotony. Others muttered under their breath or grumbled at the never-ending cycle, but Elena embraced it. She liked routine. Routine kept the mind still. By 0500, she was already at the flight line, shoulders squared, arms strong despite her small frame. Her duty was straightforward ordnance loading. While pilots briefed and mechanics double-checked fuel lines, Elena's hands worked with practiced efficiency, hoisting the sleek pods of Hydra 70 rockets, checking fuses, and attaching them beneath the Apache's stub wings. She knew the rhythm by heart. Lift, secure, test, move on. The helicopters were hungry, and she was the one who fed them. To most who passed her, she looked like any other junior soldier. Brown eyes, sharp, uniform crisp, but dust-streaked from the morning wind, face expressionless, under the strain of lifting heavy loads. But those who watched closer saw a quiet focus in her movements, almost reverent. She touched each rocket as though it carried more than firepower, something unspoken, something personal. "Ramirez, you move faster than half the loaders here," joked Specialist Carter, her partner on the line, as he struggled with his own pod. Elena offered a half smile, but said nothing. She wasn't one for idle banter. Work came first, words second. She had learned long ago that silence often earned more respect than chatter. Still, in moments like this, when the sun climbed higher, and the desert heat began to settle in her mind, sometimes drifted, she thought of her father's stories, the ones he told late at night back in El Paso. He had spoken of skies, of machines, of men who became legends, not because they were extraordinary, but because they had answered when called. She remembered the way his voice had softened when he spoke of her grandfather, a man she had never met, but whose shadow loomed over their family like a proud guardian. It was that shadow that made her choose the Army, though she never told anyone. To her peers, she was just another recruit, another name in a long list. No one asked why she carried herself with such determination, and she offered no explanation. On this particular morning, the line was busier than usual. A scheduled live-fire training exercise had the entire base humming. Pilots were double-checking maps, ground crews were hustling between hangars, and commanding officers prowled like hawks. The Apaches, sleek and intimidating even at rest, stood ready for war games that simulated the chaos of combat. Elena's job, though repetitive, carried weight. A misloaded rocket could mean a training disaster or worse. Ramirez. The voice cut through the hum of activity. She straightened instinctively. Colonel Davis was walking the line, boots crunching against the gravel, eyes sharp under the brim of his cap. Davis was known for his attention to detail, the kind of commander who could spot a crooked patch from 50 feet away. He had flown the Apaches in Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond, and carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had seen chaos firsthand. Elena dipped her head respectfully and went back to securing the final rocket pod. Davis paused nearby, watching her work. To him, she was another young soldier, barely in her 20s, trying to prove herself. Nothing unusual. Still, something about her methodical pace caught his attention. She worked with a precision he admired, not rushing, not dragging, but moving in perfect time with the machine itself. He said nothing and moved on, inspecting the next team. The morning wore on. Sweat gathered under her vest, dust stuck to her. Gloves, and the roar of engines began to echo as pilots started their systems checks. The Apaches came alive one by one, rotor blades chopping the air, sending dust devils spiraling across the tarmac. Elena shielded her face with her arm, but she kept working, checking one last connection beneath the stub wing. It was in that moment, as she stepped back to wipe the sweat from her brow, that the small insignia stitched onto the edge of her vest caught the sunlight. The colors faded from years of wear flared briefly in the glare. It wasn't part of her official uniform. Most people would have missed it entirely. Just another patch among many. But Davis, circling back from his inspection, caught it out of the corner of his eye. He froze mid-step. The insignia wasn't familiar to most soldiers on base. But to Davis, a student of military history and a man who respected tradition, it was unmistakable. His brows furrowed as he studied it closer. The patch wasn't army issue, nor was it a novelty piece like some soldiers wore off duty. This was different. It was the eagle, the emblem of a Squadron 201, the famed Mexican fighter squadron of World War II. For a long second, Davis said nothing. Elena, unaware of his scrutiny, moved on to the next helicopter, her movements fluid, her focus absolute. But the colonel's mind was already racing. Why would a junior U.S. Army soldier be wearing the insignia of a foreign unit that had flown 80 years earlier in the Pacific? And not just any foreign unit, but one that held deep symbolic ties to America's own wartime history. The desert wind gusted again, lifting dust across the flight line. To everyone else, it was just another morning of drills, another day under the relentless sun. But to Davis, something had shifted. The ordinary had cracked open, revealing a story buried beneath the surface. And though Elena Ramirez continued to load rockets with her usual quiet determination, unaware of the eyes on her, the insignia she carried was about to change how the entire base saw her. The day had begun like any other, but the desert had a way of revealing secrets when least expected. The sound of Apache rotors filled the air, their thunder rolling over the flat desert like a heartbeat. Colonel James Davis had walked this line countless times, but this morning felt different. Maybe it was the tension of the upcoming exercise. Maybe it was the heat rising early from the asphalt. Or maybe it was that fleeting flash of color he had caught on a soldier's vest. At first, he thought he had imagined it. Soldiers often carried personal touches keychains hidden in pockets. Lucky coins tucked into boots, even tiny charms sewn into gloves. But a patch? That was bolder. Unauthorized insignias were rare, and Davis prided himself on spotting them. Discipline started with the uniform. If a soldier thought they could bend the rules with something small, they might bend them when it mattered. He lingered near the helicopter Elena Ramirez had just finished loading. The aircraft loomed like a predator, sleek black with pods of hydro rockets clamped to its wings, its nose bristling with sensors and guns. Davis had flown Apaches for nearly 2 decades. He respected the machine's hunger, its power. But his eyes weren't on the helicopter. They were on her. Ramirez moved with quiet certainty, muscles flexing beneath the dust-streaked fabric of her uniform as she secured another strap. There was nothing outwardly unusual. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Yet when she shifted, the faint glint of that insignia reappeared. Davis stepped closer. It was there, stitched onto her vest near the seam, faded by time but unmistakable. A golden eagle poised for flight, wings spread wide, clutching arrows. Around it, the remnants of a circular border with words too frayed to read, but Davis already knew them. He had studied enough history to recognize the symbol instantly. Escuadron 201, the Aztec Eagles. He blinked, and memory took him back to a lecture hall at West Point years ago. A guest historian had spoken passionately about the Mexican pilots who trained in Texas and fought in the Philippines during World War II. 58 young men had crossed borders, defied language barriers, and flown under both Mexican and American colors. Their P-47 Thunderbolts had roared over Luzon, striking Japanese positions in one of the fiercest campaigns of the Pacific. They had lost men. They had earned honor. And then, like so many wartime alliances, they had been folded into history's shadows, remembered only by specialists and families. What was their eagle doing here, on a young ordnance loader's vest in Arizona? Private, Elena turned, snapping to attention. Sir. Her voice was steady, respectful, though her dark eyes flickered with the slightest trace of unease. Davis gestured toward her vest. That patch. Where did you get it? For the first time all morning, her hands stilled. The noise of the flight line seemed to grow louder, the roar of turbines, the clatter of tools, the shouts of crews, yet between the two of them, there was a silence thick enough to touch. Sir, it's from my family. Family? Yes, sir. She hesitated, then lowered her eyes briefly before forcing them back up. It belonged to my grandfather. Her voice carried no defiance, no attempt to explain further unless asked. That was the Army way. Answer the question. Nothing more. But Davis wasn't satisfied. He could have ordered her to remove it immediately. Regulations were clear. Instead, curiosity rooted him to the spot. Your grandfather served? Yes, sir. Captain Arturo Ramirez. Escuadron 201. The name hit him like a spark to dry. Tinder. He hadn't expected confirmation so quickly, so matter-of-factly. Not a collector's item, not a knockoff, not some thrift store oddity. This was bloodline. Davis studied her face again, searching for some trace of hesitation or bravado, but found only calm steadiness. She wasn't showing it off. She wasn't boasting. She wore it quietly, almost reverently, as if it were less a badge and more a prayer. Did you know him? He asked. No, sir. He died before I was born, but my father told me his stories. Said he kept this insignia close, even when he flew. When he passed away, my father gave it to me. I keep it here, for him. Her words were simple, but Davis felt the weight beneath them. Soldiers carried many burdens, rifles, gear, orders. But this was different. This was a lineage, stitched into fabric and flesh. For a moment, Davis considered pressing further. He could have asked why she risked disciplinary action by wearing an unauthorized patch. He could have asked whether she even understood the full history behind it. But the look in her eyes stopped him. She did understand. Maybe more than most of the officers on this base ever would. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the tarmac, rattling the Apaches and sending dust spiraling into the air. Elena blinked against it, raising her arm to shield her face. Davis turned away, but his mind was already racing. This couldn't stay unnoticed. A discovery like this, it wasn't just about uniform violations or personal tokens. It was about connection, a thread between generations, between nations. Something worth remembering in a world too eager to forget. Yet he also knew soldiers talked. If word spread clumsily, it could turn into ridicule, suspicion, or worse. He needed to control the story before it slipped from his hands. Carry on, Private, he said finally, his voice even. Yes, sir. She returned to her work, bending to tighten a strap on the rocket pod. But as Davis walked away, his boots striking firmly against the gravel, his thoughts lingered on. The insignia. He had seen many things in his career: men breaking under fire, machines burning in the desert night, moments of courage that could never be written in after-action reports. But this was something different. A hidden emblem, worn by a quiet soldier, holding a forgotten legacy in plain sight. By the time he reached the end of the flight line, the colonel's jaw was set. He needed to know more about her, about her grandfather, about why the army, his army, had let such a chapter of history vanish into silence. The helicopters roared to life, their blades hammering the air as if the sky itself were trembling. But beneath the thunder, Davis felt the stirrings of something quieter and more dangerous than any training exercise: curiosity, respect, and a sense of responsibility that pressed against his chest like a weight. He had noticed the insignia, and nothing about this day would be ordinary again. Colonel James Davis didn't often find himself distracted. Years of combat flying, years of command, years of watching soldiers come and go, those had carved discipline into his bones. Yet that night, long after the roar of helicopters had faded and the desert had settled into silence, his mind refused to rest. He sat at his desk in the small office overlooking the hangars, the dim light of a single lamp spilling over stacks of reports. The paperwork should have claimed his attention: readiness assessments, fuel requisitions, training logs. But the insignia of the Golden Eagle, with its proud wings and battered stitching, loomed larger than any line item. Squadron 201. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Most soldiers had never even heard of the unit. Even among officers, its name rarely surfaced. History had a cruel way of burying stories that didn't fit neatly into textbooks. But Davis remembered. The Aztec Eagles, as American pilots had called them. 58 men from Mexico, trained in the United States, flown across the Pacific, into a war not their own. They had taken the fight to Luzon in 1945, their P-47 Thunderbolts screaming over jungles and mountains, diving on Japanese convoys and strongholds. They had lost 5 of their brothers, buried them far from home, and returned carrying scars, some visible, some not. For Mexico, it had been a moment of pride, proof of solidarity, proof of courage, proof that their flag could fly beside America's in the crucible of global war. For America, it had been a welcome reinforcement, though one soon overshadowed by the titanic scale of battles elsewhere. And for the world, it had been one of countless stories swallowed by the tide of history. But here, decades later, their eagle lived on. Not in a museum, not in a book, but on the vest of a quiet ordnance loader named Elena Ramirez. Davis rubbed his temples. Why did it matter so much to him? He could have dismissed it as sentimentality. A soldier carrying family pride, nothing more. Yet he knew better. The army thrived on lineage, on traditions passed from one generation to the next. Flags, mottos, crests, they were more than decorations. They were anchors, reminders that the struggles of the past shaped the victories of the present. And if Ramirez truly was the granddaughter of one of those pilots, he pushed away from the desk and stood, pacing the narrow office. His boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, echoing the restlessness in his chest. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about recognition, about justice. The next morning, the base buzzed with its usual routines. Helicopters thundered overhead, trucks rattled down dusty lanes, and cadences echoed as units jogged past the barracks. But to Davis, everything felt sharper, more urgent. He moved through the halls with purpose, stopping briefly at the archives office before heading back to the flight line. Inside the small archive room, a place most soldiers ignored, he flipped through folders, eyes scanning yellowed pages and faded photographs. The army kept everything, even when no one cared to look. And there it was, A dossier marked Squadron 201. He pulled it free, rushing dust from the cover. The first page bore a photograph of smiling young men in flight suits, standing shoulder to shoulder with American airmen. Their planes' P-47 Thunderbolts gleamed behind them, proud and deadly. Davis studied their faces, wondering if he could spot Captain Arturo Ramirez among them. Line after line of reports followed: mission logs, casualty lists, commendations. They told a story, not just of combat, but of resolve. These men had stepped onto foreign soil, fought under foreign command, and bled for a cause that stretched beyond their homeland's borders. And then they had gone home, to lives that history forgot. Davis closed the file slowly. His respect for the unit deepened with every page. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a revelation. Later that day, he found Ramirez again. She was back at the flight line, tightening a bolt on a rocket pod, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The Insignia was still there, catching the sun when she shifted. "Private Ramirez," Davis said, his voice steady. She straightened instantly. "Sir?" "I looked into your grandfather's unit," he said, watching her reaction. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quick, subtle, but there. "Sir?" "Squadron 201, the Aztec Eagles. I read their records this morning." For a moment, she seemed uncertain whether to respond. Then she nodded once. "Yes, sir. My father told me about them. He said my grandfather flew missions in Luzon. He didn't like to talk about it much, but it meant everything to him. He kept this insignia after the war. My father passed it down. Now it's mine." Her hand brushed the patch briefly, almost unconsciously. "You know it's unauthorized," Davis said. "Yes, sir." She didn't flinch. He studied her, weighing discipline against understanding. Regulations were the lifeblood of the Army, but there were times when rules alone didn't capture the full truth. "Why do you wear it anyway?" Her gaze dropped for the first time. She hesitated, then lifted her eyes back to his. "Because it reminds me that I'm not the first. That my family stood where I'm standing now, even if it was in another time, another war. I don't want to forget that." The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any lecture could have. Soldiers carried photos, dog tags, letters. This was her version. Not defiance, not vanity, just remembrance. Davis let the silence hang for a moment before nodding. "Understood. Carry on." She returned to her work, and he walked away, but the meaning of that insignia lingered. It was no longer just a patch. It was a bridge. Between nations, between generations, between forgotten sacrifices and present duty. And as Davis stepped out into the blinding desert sun, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this story fade again. That evening, in the mess hall, Davis shared the story with a few trusted officers. He spoke not of regulation violations, but of history, of how Mexican pilots had flown beside Americans, of how their bravery had been overshadowed by larger battles, of how one soldier on this very base carried their legacy in plain sight. The reaction was immediate. Curiosity sparked. Some officers pulled out phones, searching for articles, scrolling through images of unfamiliar faces in flight suits. Others listened quietly, brows furrowed as if weighing the significance. "Never heard of them," one captain admitted, shaking his head. "But damn, that's something." Davis nodded. "It is. And it's something we should remember." Across the room, Elena sat with her tray of food, quiet as always. She noticed the glances, the subtle nods, the shift in tone around her. She didn't know what Davis had said, but she could feel the change. The insignia had always been her private reminder, invisible to others. Now it had become something more, a spark spreading through the ranks, drawing attention to a story she thought was long buried. She lowered her gaze to her plate, her fingers brushing the edge of the patch again. Her grandfather's eagle, faded but proud, seemed to watch over her. And for the first time since she'd sewn it onto her vest, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was meant to be seen. The desert dusk had a way of softening everything, the jagged lines of hangars, the harsh glare of the flight line, even the steel edges of the Apaches standing guard in the fading light. By the time Private First Class Elena Ramirez finished her shift, the sun was bleeding orange across the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the sand. She moved quietly toward the barracks, her boots crunching against gravel, her vest heavy with dust and sweat. She felt the weight of the day in her shoulders, but she also felt something else in awareness. Ever since Colonel Davis had asked about her patch, eyes seemed to follow her more often. Not in a hostile way, not yet, but in curiosity. Soldiers nodded at her in the mess hall. Officers lingered a little longer when she passed. The insignia she once thought invisible had become a signal, a story begging to be told. Inside her room, she dropped onto the narrow bed and let her back rest against the wall. She unclipped the vest slowly, laying it across her knees. The patch caught the dim light of the single bulb overhead, its threads frayed, its eagle still. Proud, she traced its outline with her finger, as she had done 100 times before. Her father's voice filled her memory, low and steady. Your grandfather was a pilot, Mia. Not just any pilot in Aztec Eagle. He flew with the Americans in the war. He carried this insignia on his chest every time he went up. Said it reminded him who he was fighting for. She had been a child when he first told her, too young to understand the depth of sacrifice, but old enough to know it mattered. Over the years, the story became part of her, as much as the color of her eyes or the cadence of her heartbeat. Her father had guarded the insignia for decades, keeping it in a wooden box along with photographs, letters, and medals. When he grew ill, when the strength began to leave his voice, he had called Elena to his side. It's yours now, he had said, pressing the patch into her palm. Don't let them forget. She never asked who them was. She knew. The world had forgotten Esquadron 201. Even in school, when history teachers spoke of World War II, they skipped over Mexico's role entirely, as if it had never happened. But her father made sure she knew. He showed her photographs of Captain Arturo Ramirez in his flight suit, goggles pushed back, a faint smile on his lips. He showed her letters written in careful Spanish, ink fading but words still strong. And he told her of the day Arturo never came home from the airfield, his plane lost in a storm over Luzon. Her father had been only a boy then. The grief had never left him, but neither had the pride. Now, decades later, Elena carried both. Pride, because she bore the name and the legacy. Grief, because the world seemed to move on as though none of it mattered. She pressed the patch to her chest and closed her eyes. The next day, the secret began to spread further. During morning drills, Specialist Carter jogged beside her, his grin easy, his voice teasing. So, Ramirez, what's this I hear about you being some kind of war hero's granddaughter? Elena shot him a look. I'm no hero. Didn't say you were, but your granddad sounds like one. He winked, then fell back into formation. Later, in the mess hall, another soldier slid into the seat across from her. Squadron 201, right? I looked it up last night. Never knew Mexico. Even fought in World War II. Crazy stuff. Elena nodded, her fork pausing mid-air. Most people don't know. Well, they should. Sounds like your grandfather was a badass. She didn't respond. Compliments made her uneasy. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. By evening, even the senior officers seemed to buzz with quiet curiosity. Davis, for his part, kept his distance, but Elena could feel his influence. He had started something, intentionally or not. What had once been her private inheritance was now public knowledge, and there was no way to pull it back into the shadows. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself at the small chapel on the edge of the base. The desert was silent around her, stars spilling across the black sky in a way that always reminded her of home. She sat in the pew alone, the patch still, stitched firmly to her vest, and let her thoughts wander. She remembered her father's stories in more detail now, the way he spoke of Arturo's squadron training in Texas, struggling with English commands, laughing with American airmen despite the language barrier. She remembered his pride when he described the missions over the Philippines, how Mexican pilots had strafed enemy convoys and bombed strongholds, flying low through anti-aircraft fire. They were young, her father had said, barely older than you are now, but they flew like they had nothing to lose. Elena's chest tightened. She wondered if she could ever live up to that. She was no pilot, no daring ace. She was an ordnance loader, anonymous among many, her work unnoticed except when something went wrong. Yet wasn't that what her grandfather had done too? Served quietly, bravely, without expecting fame or recognition. A whisper of wind rustled the chapel's wooden beams, and she bowed her head. "Abuelo," she murmured softly, "I hope I'm making you proud." Meanwhile, in his office, Davis was wrestling with his own thoughts. He had spent the day fielding questions from curious officers and young soldiers. Some treated the story like a novelty, something to spice up the monotony of base life. Others seemed genuinely moved, digging deeper, reading every article they could find. But Davis couldn't shake the weight of it. He had seen how easily soldiers became statistics, their names fading once the wars ended. He had lost friends whose stories never left the after-action reports. And now here was proof of an entire squadron, brave men from a neighboring nation, reduced to a footnote. He thought of Ramirez, of the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, of the way her hand had brushed the patch as though it were a living thing. She wasn't just honoring her grandfather, she was preserving him. Preserving all of them. He made a decision. 2 days later, Elena was summoned to his office. She entered stiffly, standing at attention, eyes straight ahead. "At ease, Private," Davis said. She shifted slightly, hands clasped behind her back. "I've been thinking about your grandfather's insignia," he began. "About the story it carries. I won't lie, regulations would normally require me to have you remove it. But I think this is different. I think this is something worth remembering, not hiding." Her eyes widened slightly. "Sir, I've spoken with command. We're organizing a small ceremony next week. Nothing formal, just a recognition. We'll honor your grandfather and Squadron 201. Soldiers need to know their history, not just American history, but the history of those who stood beside us." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Her throat tightened, her chest heavy, with something she couldn't name. Finally, she managed a quiet, "Thank you, sir." Davis nodded. "You should be proud, Ramirez." Very proud. She left the office in a daze, the desert sun blinding as she stepped outside. For years, the insignia had been her secret, her private promise to a grandfather she had never known. Now, it was no longer just hers. It belonged to the unit, too. The base, maybe even to the army itself. And as she touched the patch once more, she felt a shift inside her. The secret she had guarded so carefully was no longer a burden. It was a torch, one she was ready to carry into the open. The desert had a way of amplifying noise. Helicopter engines, shouted commands, even laughter in the mess hall seemed sharper, louder, carried on the dry wind across Fort Apache. But this week, there was a different kind of sound rising across. The base a hum of conversation, of curiosity, of soldiers telling each other a story that none of them had known before. Private First Class Elena Ramirez had become the subject of that story. It wasn't that she wanted the attention. She had always been the type to keep her head down, to let her work speak for her. But ever since Colonel Davis announced the upcoming recognition ceremony, her name carried a weight she hadn't expected. When she walked into the chow line, voices lowered. When she passed by the flight line, soldiers nodded with newfound respect. And when her patch caught the sunlight, people seemed to look twice not at her, but at the history stitched into her vest. At first, the attention unsettled her. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone admired. She was an ordnance loader, one of dozens, performing work that most people overlooked. Her duty wasn't glamorous. It was sweaty, heavy, and often thankless. She hadn't expected her grandfather's story to spill over into her own. But the base had a way of seizing on to stories, and this one had spread like wildfire. In the hangar, Specialist Carter slapped her on the back as they worked. "You know, Ramirez, you're making the rest of us look bad. I mean, I've been here 2 years, and nobody's ever called a ceremony for my family." Elena rolled her eyes, but couldn't help a faint smile. "That's because your family's legacy is probably beer pong." The other loaders laughed, but Carter held up his hands. "Hey, don't knock tradition. But seriously, this is something else. People are actually reading history books around here. Never thought I'd see the day." He wasn't wrong. In the barracks, soldiers who barely cracked a manual were now scrolling through articles on their phones, searching for information about his Squadron 201. Some even debated missions, arguing over sorties and casualty figures like armchair historians. For many, it was the first time they realized Mexico had played a direct role in World War II. "You're telling me they flew with us?" one young private said during lunch. "Not just with us," another corrected, scrolling through his phone. "They trained in Texas, then flew in the Philippines. Real combat missions. Lost 5 men? That's no joke." "Damn, how come we never learned this in school?" Elena overheard the conversations, her cheeks warming. It felt strange hearing strangers discuss her family's history, but it also felt right. Her grandfather's name had lived in whispers at her father's kitchen table, in faded photographs and fragile letters. Now it echoed in the voices of soldiers who had never met him. Even the officers seemed to take notice. At the weekly briefing, Davis mentioned the upcoming ceremony, his tone steady, but his words carrying unusual weight. "History isn't just about battles and victories," he said. "It's about the people who stood shoulder to shoulder when it mattered. Next week, we'll take time to recognize a unit that's often overlooked as Squadron 201. And through Private Ramirez, we'll honor their legacy." The room was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that marked genuine reflection. Then one major nodded, another tapped his pen thoughtfully, and the meeting continued. For Davis, it wasn't just about Ramirez anymore. It was about the message. Soldiers needed to remember that alliances weren't forged only on paper. They were forged in blood, in sacrifice, in the stories that too often faded into dust. As the days passed, Elena began to notice subtle changes. The mess hall sergeant, usually gruff and impatient, greeted her with a nod and a quiet "Good morning, Private." Pilots who rarely acknowledged ground crew stopped to thank her as she loaded their aircraft. One even asked, "Your grandfather flew combat missions? That's incredible. Guess bravery runs in the family." She didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't feel brave. She felt ordinary, lifting rockets, tightening bolts, sweating under the desert sun. But perhaps bravery wasn't always about grand gestures. Perhaps it was about showing up, carrying a legacy, doing the work, even when no one noticed. One evening, as she walked back to the barracks, a young private jogged up beside her. He was barely out of high school, freckles still scattered across his cheeks, his uniform hanging loose on his thin frame. "Private Ramirez?" he asked, a little breathless. "Yes, I just wanted to say. My grandfather fought in Korea. I never really thought about it much before. But hearing about yours, it made me want to learn more. About him. About what he went through." He hesitated, then added, "So, thanks." Alana's throat tightened. She managed a small nod. "You should ask your family. Don't wait too long." The private smiled, then jogged off, leaving her standing in the fading light, her heart heavy but full. By the time the ceremony approached, the base felt transformed. Posters of the Aztec eagles, printed from old photographs, appeared on bulletin boards. A handful of soldiers practiced Spanish phrases, laughing at their accents, but eager to connect. The library reported a spike in requests for books on Mexico's role in World War II, and everywhere she went, Elena felt the ripple of recognition. Not of her, she reminded herself of that often, but of her grandfather and his brothers-in-arms. Their insignia had sparked something bigger than she had ever imagined. The night before the ceremony, Davis stood at his office window, watching the moonlight bathe the hangars in silver. He thought of the years he had spent flying Apaches, of the names he had carved into the back of his mind: friends lost, mentors gone, soldiers buried far from home. He thought of how easy it was for stories to vanish, swallowed by the grind of new wars and new battles. But not this one. Not now. He turned to the desk, where the old dossier lay open, a photograph staring up at him. 58 young men, proud and determined, standing in front of their planes. He wondered which one was Arturo Ramirez. He wondered if the man had ever imagined his granddaughter would one day serve under the same flag he had fought beside. And he wondered how many other forgotten stories were waiting to be rediscovered. That night, Elena lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Her vest hung on the chair nearby, the patch glowing faintly in the moonlight. Tomorrow, it would no longer be just hers. Tomorrow, the whole base would see it, would honor it. For years, she had carried the insignia in silence, afraid that speaking of it would sound like boasting. But now, she realized, keeping it hidden had been the greater mistake. History lived only if it was shared. She closed her eyes, whispering into the darkness, "Abuelo, I hope you'll be there with me." And in the quiet of the desert night, she felt as though he already was. The desert sun was merciless that morning, its heat rolling off the tarmac in waves. Soldiers lined up in neat formations, boots clicking, uniforms crisp despite the sweat gathering at their collars. The ceremony was small by army standards. No brass bands, no parades, yet the air buzzed with anticipation. For most, it was just another day on base, but for Private First Class Elena Ramirez, it was a day she never imagined would happen. She stood near the front, her vest polished, her insignia shining brighter than it ever had before. Her heart thudded against her ribs like a drumbeat. Colonel Davis walked to the podium, his frame straight and his voice carrying across the open. "Air. Today," he began, "we pause not for ourselves, but for those whose stories risked being forgotten." The soldiers shifted slightly, listening. 80 years ago, in the midst of the Second World War, 58 young men from Mexico traveled north to train in the United States. They learned our language, flew our aircraft, and stood shoulder to shoulder with American pilots in the skies over the Philippines. They were Esquadron 201, the Aztec Eagles. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Many had heard the story in fragments over the last week. Now they were hearing it in full, framed by the authority of their commander. They flew combat missions, Davis continued, his eyes scanning the rows. They strafed enemy positions, bombed convoys, and risked everything far from their homeland. 5 never returned. And though their contributions were real, history did not always give them the place they deserved. He paused, letting the silence sink in. But today, we remember. And we do so through one of our own. Private First Class Elena Ramirez is the granddaughter of Captain Arturo Ramirez, one of those brave pilots. She carries his insignia on her vest, a symbol of sacrifice, of unity, of a shared fight for freedom. Elena felt her chest tighten as every eye turned toward her. She kept her chin high, but her throat burned with emotion. Davis gestured to her. Private Ramirez stepped forward. Her boots echoed against the pavement as she walked, each step heavy yet resolute. She stood before the podium, saluting sharply. Your grandfather's legacy is not forgotten, Davis said, nor is the bond forged between our nations. On behalf of this base, and in honor of Squadron 201, we recognize you as the living reminder of that sacrifice. He reached into a small box and pulled out a framed photograph, an archival image of the Aztec Eagles standing proudly beside their aircraft. Beneath it, a plaque read, Squadron 201, the Aztec Eagles. Allied Heroes, 1945. The colonel handed it to her. For a moment, her hands trembled. She stared at the faces in the photograph, faces she had only seen in her father's keepsakes, faces full of youth and determination. Somewhere among them was her grandfather, frozen in time. Thank you, sir, she managed, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. The soldiers erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or raucous, it was steady, deliberate, respectful. Elena swallowed hard, holding the frame close, as though it were a piece of her family returned to her. After the ceremony, the base buzzed with energy. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before came up, offering handshakes, claps on the shoulder, words of admiration. Your grandfather was a legend. Proud day, Ramirez. Hell of a story. Makes me want to call my grandma, ask about her past. Elena accepted each word with humility, though part of her still felt unworthy. She hadn't flown missions, hadn't risked her life in dogfights. But she realized now it wasn't about measuring up to Arturo. It was about carrying his memory forward. In the mess hall that evening, the mood was different. Soldiers shared family stories about uncles in Vietnam, grandmothers in factories, great-grandfathers who'd crossed oceans. What began with a Squadron 201 had turned into something larger. Soldiers weren't just comparing rifles and ranks. Anymore, they were comparing legacies. Specialist Carter raised his tray. To the Aztec Eagles, he said. To the Aztec Eagles, the room echoed, voices blending into one. Elena raised her cup too, her chest swelling. For the first time, she felt the weight of her grandfather's insignia, not as a burden, but as a bridge. That night, Davis found her in the hangar, alone with the Apaches. She was still in uniform, the framed photograph resting on a workbench beside her. You handled yourself well today, he said, his tone softer than usual. Elena looked up. I didn't do anything. Sir, it was all him. Them. She gestured to the photo. You did more than you realize. Stories like these die in silence. You gave it a voice. She hesitated, then asked, do you think it matters? Really matters? Beyond this base? Davis studied her for a moment. I've fought in enough places to know this. The wars may change, the enemies may change, but courage is universal. Your grandfather's story matters because it reminds us we never fight alone. And one day, someone will remember you the same way. His words settled over her like a mantle. She nodded slowly. In the weeks that followed, the legacy grew. The framed photograph was hung in the base library, where soldiers lingered to study it between shifts. The insignia became a quiet symbol of pride, not just for Elena, but for anyone who believed in honoring forgotten sacrifices. Some soldiers began tracing their own histories. One discovered a Navajo code talker in his lineage. Another learned his grandmother had been one of the Rosie the Riveters, who built planes during the war. Stories surfaced like hidden rivers, each one adding depth to the collective identity of the base. And through it all, Elena kept working, loading rockets, checking bolts, sweating under the desert sun. She hadn't changed her role, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt small. Her grandfather had fought in the skies, she realized, but her battlefield was here, now in the desert. In the shadows of Apache, she helped keep alive. Different wars, same courage. One evening, as she walked past the chapel, she paused. The stars burned bright above, the desert air cool against her skin. She looked up and whispered, "Abuelo, they remember now. They finally remember." Breeze stirred, soft and fleeting, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and fuel. And for the first time, she didn't just hope he was proud, she knew he was. The applause had faded, but the ripples of Elena Ramirez's recognition continued to spread through Fort Apache. Soldiers spoke her name in hushed tones, officers nodded with acknowledgement, and the Aztec Eagle's story had been etched into the base's collective consciousness. Yet not all responses were warm. In the days following the ceremony, murmurs of disapproval began to surface. Some soldiers whispered about rules and regulations. Unauthorized insignia, they muttered, recalling army manuals and code. Others wondered why a junior enlisted soldier had garnered attention above more senior personnel, feeling a twinge of resentment. The quiet admiration Elena once inspired became layered with scrutiny. Colonel Davis anticipated these reactions. He had spent decades in command, learning that recognition often brought envy along with respect. He had also learned that history, especially forgotten history, could challenge people's perspectives in uncomfortable ways. One afternoon, as Elena was checking the rocket pods of an Apache on the tarmac, Sergeant Miller approached, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Private Ramirez," he said, voice low but firm. "I hear about this ceremony. Everyone's talking about your grandfather. It's impressive, but you do realize rules exist for a reason, right?" Elena straightened immediately, hands gloved and gripping a wrench. "Yes, Sergeant." "I'm not saying your family's story isn't important," Miller continued, softer now. "But some people feel singled out. Some think, well, let's just say the optics are complicated." Elena nodded, her chest tightening. She didn't feel singled out. She felt honored. But she also understood the tension. Recognition came with responsibility, and she wasn't sure she was ready to bear the weight. Meanwhile, Davis held meetings with senior officers, planning how to manage the story's impact. He wanted the ceremony to inspire, not divide. He emphasized context. The insignia was more than a patch. It was a living memory of sacrifice, courage, and shared alliance. He reminded them that honoring history wasn't about favoritism, it was about truth. Sometimes history chooses its own messengers, Davis told them. And sometimes the quietest soldier carries the loudest story. Still, complaints reached his office. Anonymous notes appeared in mailboxes. Why her? Or rules are rules. Some accused him of favoritism. Some questioned whether historical recognition belonged in a training exercise setting. Davis didn't respond immediately. He knew that addressing dissent required patience. The story wasn't just about Elena. It was about the Aztec Eagles. It was about the value of remembering. And history, he reminded himself, often made people uncomfortable before it taught them anything. On the tarmac, Elena continued her work, oblivious to the storm brewing in the offices. She focused on the machinery, the rockets, the hum of the Apache engines. Her hands moved with precision, each bolt tightened, each strap secured, as if her grandfather were watching. She drew comfort from the routine. Work always grounded her when attention felt overwhelming. Yet that night, in the solitude of the barracks, doubts crept in. She replayed Sergeant Miller's words and wondered, was she doing the right thing? Did she deserve this attention? Did her grandfather, the man whose story she carried, want her in the spotlight? Her thoughts wandered to the insignia itself. Once it had been a private tribute, a small emblem sewn onto fabric. Now it was a symbol witnessed by dozens, discussed by hundreds, admired and criticized in equal measure. She traced it with her fingers, feeling the rough threads and faded embroidery. She realized that the insignia had grown beyond her control. It was no longer just her grandfather's story. It belonged to everyone who remembered. Tensions came to a head during a midday training session. Soldiers lined up for a flight drill, and murmurs followed her as she moved between helicopters. Some made casual remarks, intended as jokes, but biting nonetheless. "Look at Ramirez, the historian," one muttered. "Next thing you know, she'll be teaching us about World War II mid-flight." Elena kept her head down, focusing on her work. But the comments stung. Even heroes had critics, she realized, and recognition carried consequences. It wasn't just about honor, it was about navigating human jealousy, pride, and misunderstanding. Later, in a private conversation, Davis approached her while she checked a pod. "I know it's not easy," he said quietly. "Some people will question why history matters. Some will envy, some will resist. But you did nothing wrong. You honored your grandfather. You honored the Aztec eagles." Elena looked up, eyes weary but determined. I don't want people thinking it's about me. It's not." "I understand," Davis replied. "And that's why we'll keep the focus on the legacy. History isn't about one person, it's about many, and you're the link." The base slowly began to adapt. Officers reminded squads about the ceremony, sharing the story in briefings. Soldiers who had complained were exposed to more detailed accounts of Squadron 201. They saw photographs of young men in flight suits, read mission logs, and understood the context. Awareness replaced envy with curiosity, and eventually, with respect. Even Sergeant Miller softened over time. He approached Elena one morning, hands on his hips, a reluctant smile on his face. "You know," he said, "I didn't get it at first. Thought this was all just fluff. But seeing you carry that patch, seeing how serious you are about it, I get it now. History matters." Elena nodded. She didn't say anything. Sometimes, silence said more than words. Meanwhile, the ceremony's impact spread beyond the base. News of a young U.S. Army soldier honoring her grandfather's Mexican squadron circulated among military historians online. Social media buzzed with mentions of the Aztec eagles. Articles highlighted the collaborative efforts between nations. During World War II, letters arrived at the base from veterans and descendants, sharing gratitude and personal stories. Elena was amazed by the response. She hadn't sought recognition, and yet the insignia she wore, the story she carried, had sparked a conversation far larger than herself. It connected past and present, showing how individual acts of remembrance could ripple through time. By the end of the week, the base atmosphere had shifted. Soldiers approached Elena not with envy, but with curiosity. Officers shared tidbits of history during briefings. Conversations about courage, sacrifice, and heritage replaced idle gossip. And Elena realized that her role loading rockets, maintaining helicopters was not diminished by recognition. If anything, it became more meaningful. Every bolt she tightened, every rocket she secured, was now part of a living tradition. The insignia no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a bridge, a link between the past and the present, between nations and generations, between those who fought and those who remembered. Late one evening, Elena stood at the edge of the flight line, watching the sun sink behind distant mountains. The Apaches were silent now, resting after a long day of drills. She traced her fingers over the patch one last time, feeling its rough threads against her palm. She whispered softly, "Abuelo, they see now. They finally see." A gentle desert wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of dust, oil, and the promise of new stories yet to be told. Elena realized that recognition wasn't just applause or ceremony, it was responsibility. She carried the past forward, ensured that history lived, and reminded everyone that courage, sacrifice, and honor never faded. And though not every response had been easy, though some had questioned her, Elena understood that the journey of remembrance was always worth it. For her grandfather, for the Aztec eagles, for those who would come after. Months had passed since the ceremony honoring Squadron 201. The desert sun still beat down relentlessly on Fort Apache. The helicopters still roared overhead, and soldiers still moved with precision across the flight line. Yet the base had changed in subtle, enduring ways. For Private First Class Elena Ramirez, the recognition of her grandfather's legacy was no longer a singular moment. It had become a living, breathing part of daily life. Soldiers referenced the Aztec eagles in training exercises, using their missions as examples of courage, precision, and international collaboration. Instructors reminded new arrivals that history was more than memorized dates. It was stories, carried forward by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Elena had returned to her duties with renewed purpose. She continued to load rockets, secure pods, and check the Apaches with meticulous care. Each task felt heavier with meaning, not because it was harder, but because it now symbolized continuity. Every bolt tightened was a nod to the men who had flown before her. Every Hydra rocket secured a silent salute to those who risked their lives in skies far from home. The framed photograph of Squadron 201 now hung in the library, surrounded by letters, artifacts, and articles curated by soldiers eager to learn. The story had spread beyond Fort Apache, reaching military historians, educators, and even foreign veterans organizations. Elena received letters from descendants of the squadron, each one thanking her for keeping the legacy alive. Some shared their own family photographs and memorabilia, creating a network of remembrance she never imagined would exist. Even Colonel Davis noticed the subtle transformations. During morning briefings, soldiers referenced lessons from the Aztec eagles when discussing strategy, teamwork, and leadership. When he walked across the tarmac, officers and enlisted alike nodded in acknowledgement, not to him, but to the shared story that had infused the base with pride and perspective. One evening, Davis found Elena sitting alone by the flight line, her vest folded beside her, the insignia catching the last rays of the sun. "You've done something remarkable," he said quietly, joining her. Elena looked up. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just kept a patch on my vest." Davis smiled. "It's never just a patch. You've reminded people of something far bigger than any ceremony or medal. History isn't lessons in a book. It's alive. And now it lives here." As weeks turned into months, the base incorporated the story of the Aztec eagles into training and morale-building exercises. Officers held small workshops where soldiers examined the historical photographs, mission reports, and flight logs. The insignia became a symbol not only of bravery, but of unity and shared purpose. Even soldiers who had initially been skeptical came to understand that honoring the past strengthened their commitment to the present. Ramirez herself became an unofficial ambassador of the legacy. She didn't seek attention, but her presence and quiet dedication spoke louder than words. She encouraged younger soldiers to ask questions, explore their family histories, and consider the lessons of courage, sacrifice, and humility. She reminded them that the Air Force and Army weren't just machines and orders, they were communities, built on memory, connection, and respect for those who came before. One afternoon, a group of new recruits approached her, wide-eyed and curious. "Private Ramirez," one said, "we heard about the Aztec Eagles. Is it true they flew with American pilots in combat?" Elena smiled faintly. "Yes, they trained in Texas, flew missions in the Philippines, and 5 never came back. But their bravery saved lives and strengthened bonds between nations." Another recruit leaned forward, eyes bright. "Wow, and you're—" "I'm just a granddaughter," Elena said softly, carrying their story forward. The recruits nodded, some visibly moved. For Elena, the moment was quiet, ordinary, yet profound. She realized that the insignia she wore was no longer just a family token. It had become a beacon for those willing to learn, to remember, to honor. Months later, the base received an unexpected visit. A historian from Mexico, accompanied by several veterans' descendants, came to Fort Apache to meet Elena and see the framed photographs. They shared stories of Esquadron 201's missions, anecdotes that hadn't made it into official records, and letters written in Spanish, ink faded but heartfelt. Elena listened, absorbing every word. She asked questions, traced the threads of history, and realized the insignia had created a bridge between generations and nations. Her grandfather's legacy, once nearly forgotten, was now living in the hearts of those who cared to remember. That evening, after the visitors left, she stood alone by the flight line, the Apaches silent and imposing in the twilight. She touched the insignia gently. "I hope you're proud, abuelo," she whispered. "We're making sure no one forgets you or your squadron ever again." Colonel Davis approached quietly, observing the young soldier in the desert's fading light. "You've done more than I expected," he said. Elena glanced at him. "I didn't do it for recognition, sir. I did it because it felt right. And that's exactly why it worked," he replied. "When people do things for the right reasons, the impact lasts longer than any ceremony." He paused, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "The Aztec Eagles will be remembered, not just because of history books, but because of you." As the weeks rolled into a year, the story became an inseparable part of Fort Apache's culture. The insignia was sewn onto a commemorative banner, displayed in the main hall alongside the flags of allied nations. New soldiers learned about Esquadron 201 during orientation, and veterans returning to the base often stopped to pay silent respects. The legacy spread beyond the base itself, inspiring collaborations with historians, schools, and museums. Elena continued her duties as an ordnance loader, but she also mentored younger soldiers, teaching them about responsibility, history, and the importance of remembering those who came before. She realized that courage wasn't only in combat, it was in carrying the past forward, ensuring it was never lost. One quiet evening, she visited the chapel on the edge of the base. The desert stars stretched endlessly overhead, as if echoing the vastness of the stories she now carried. She knelt in the pew, touching the insignia on her vest. "Abuelo," she whispered, "your story is safe now, and it's bigger than I ever imagined." A gentle breeze swept through the chapel, stirring the pages of old hymnals and the fabric of her uniform. In that moment, Elena felt an unspoken connection, a legacy carried across generations, bridging time and distance, linking her to men she had never met, but whose courage ran in her blood. She left the chapel that night with a sense of peace, knowing that the Aztec Eagle's story would live on, not just in history books or museum displays, but in the hearts of those who continued to honor them. And as the first light of dawn touched the desert horizon, she walked confidently to the flight line, her vest gleaming, the insignia shining proudly. The Apaches waited silently, and the base hummed with life, purpose, and remembrance. Private First Class Elena Ramirez carried more than rockets and gear. She carried history. She carried courage. She carried a legacy that would endure long after the desert sun had set countless times over.